So, good morning, everybody. I feel so happy that the room is so crowded, and thanks for coming. And so, I'm a civil servant in Brazil. I work for the National Institute of Land Reform, for short, INCRA. And I'm here as a Humphrey Fellow, which is a program that encourages us to make exchange with professionals in United States, as well as in international fellows based in United States. And I'm here at Cornell. And thanks to the LASP and Professor Craig and Bill that encouraged me to come here. And this is part of our experience here to share our work and our knowledge, and also get some feedback about the work we have been doing. So I work for the federal government in Brazil, and for the past 7 years, we have been working to address land rights and land tenure of the Afro-Brazilian communities. And my talk is much more based in my experience doing this work in Brazil. And I think I have learned to understand the claims of these groups and the challenge that exists in responding to the wide range of situations surrounding these land tenures claims. Our agency has the difficult work to grant the title deeds to this minority group in Brazil. So what I'm going to say is based on my experience, on my personal experience. I was coordinator, I was the head of the office who was in charge of running this program, but I could say that I'm not alone in my point of views. Most of the points that I will share with you are also shared by many scholars and organizations in Brazil who have been studying and working on these questions. But if you don't understand something that I say, you could just raise your hands, because it's my first talk in English, and I would be happy to try my best to make you understand, because it's a very rich, how could I say that? It's a very interesting situation in Brazil, and these groups are part of a big picture in Brazil. Which is the conflict surrounding land issues in Brazil. So I hope I will be able to give you an overview about who these communities are, what drove Brazil's government to implement a policy to grant land title deeds, and to point out the innovative and the strong point of this initiative, and also the technical challenge to achieve the legal framework that protect the culture of these groups, and to provide them with the guarantee rights to their territory, to their traditional territories. So first of all, who are these groups? And as you may know, Brazil's economy, the colonial Brazil's economy, for more than 3 centuries was based in forced labor of men and women brought from Africa during the Atlantic slave trade area by the Portuguese during our colonization, of course. So this picture is quite interesting, because Brazil imported more African slaves than any other country in the world. The estimates of people brought to work on plantation and mining varies between 3 million and 5 million Africans. So you can see the biggest circle is on the southeast Brazil. So some estimate that 12 million Africans came to Brazil, were brought to Brazil, to the Americans, sorry. And between 3 and 5 million have been brought to Brazil. So very briefly, try to synthesize this rich question. During the period of slavery in Brazil, the Afro-Brazilian communities were created by escaped slaves, but not only. After slavery was abolished, these communities continued to be created as safe havens from the general society racism surrounding them. So these communities continue to be formed throughout the country as a form of resistance and protection. They have survived for hundreds of years, resisting land conflicts and maintaining some aspects of their culture, within a general context of social exclusion. So I just put a very ancient picture that this is normally how the Brazilian people saw the Afro-Brazilian community, with this old image. But I'm trying to show you that it's not really like that. And they are contemporary groups nowadays. So we also call the Afro-Brazilian communities as Quilombo communities. And Quilombo is a word coming from the Umbundo language, which is an African language that is part of the family of the Yoruba language. And it means gathering. So these former slaves, or these former enslaved people, they gather together as a form of protection and survival. And even after the abolition of slavery, this is important to stress. So today, these communities are typically composed of descendants of formerly enslaved African. However, today, there is also mixed race members as well, having developed a culture hybrid African and non-African practice and belief. So we can say that it's a unique culture. And this is the Jongo dance. Jongo dance is a kind of a dance which we can see in the coast of the state of Rio de Janeiro. And it's a hybrid dance, Brazilian and African culture. When it comes to their making a living, most part of the Afro-Brazilian communities today sustain themselves by farming or by gathering natural resources. And most part of them live in rural areas across Brazil. So their survival is heavily dependent on natural resources provided by forests, lands, and rivers. When it comes to their social organization, normally they have a communal kind of life, and they are heavily influenced by values that have been passed down for one generation to another over the centuries. This is a good example. So at the same time, it's difficult to generalize and depict these communities in a role of characteristic or in a single model, I would say, because the Quilombos have been as diverse as the different difficulties they have faced. We can say that we find the common thread in the fact that these communities have a history of resistance against slavery and systemic racism. So this is a very common scene in a Quilombo community. They will get together and they will make a collective decision process. And that's me. And it's also important to say that the phenomenon of the fugitive or freed African forming independent settlements is not exclusive to Brazil. In other countries of South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, the African population also form their own settlements, their own community. We can mention, for example, the Maroon in Jamaica and Suriname, and the Palenques in Colombia. I think you might know that. And it's also important to say that some national governments are running programs to respond to their claims for inclusion, especially related to land rights. And I think you may question, why is there one policy to address Afro-Brazilian communities' land tenure, and what are the justifications for that? And there are many reasons for that. And the first one I have already mentioned, which is the huge impact that slavery had in our country. And another reason is that, lies on the fact that Brazil has one of the most unequal and concentrated land structure in the world. And although Brazil conducted an agrarian reform process, our Gini coefficients for land structure has remained stable since the 80s. So it's just some figures to show that the land is concentrated in Brazil yet, and 9% of the landholders hold almost 80% of the rural land in Brazil. And another important reason is that when slavery was abolished in Brazil in 1888, and I should say that we were the last country in America to do so, no measure were put in place to compensate or to include the former slave in our economy or society. And better here. When it comes to land tenures rights, we have been seeing different situations regarding the Afro-Brazilian groups. So most part of them hold land through informal means. And many scholar studies, as well as the studies conducted by INCRA, have shown the historical difficulties of these communities to acquire land in a legal way. And the fact that most part of these communities have a history of expulsion or eviction, or at least attempts of expulsion by alleged owners. So I think it's quite clear when we depict the situation, and I have to say that this has institutional reason. Our farmers' law always prevented the poorest groups to acquire in a formal way land in Brazil. And this is the case for the Afro-Brazilian, this is the case for the indigenous groups, and for the poorest group in Brazil. And just to give you an idea, one example, this is the case, this is a Quilombo community called Paiol de Telha in the state of Paraná, which is my state and Simone's state as well. And they were slaves in a sugarcane plantation, and the former owner he gave freedom to the slaves, and then gave them a parcel of land, which at that time was quite huge, and to 11 former slaves, as in his testament. So it was a kind of inheritance. But this inheritance was not formally registered. So if you go there, they have a document, but this document is not legal because it was not registered in the local registry. So for decades, they have been fighting to get their land back. So most part of them, what happened is that, first of all, one of the descendants, I think the grandson of the landowner, sold the land for many, many owners now. And then they were evicted, and some of them still resist there. So this is a true story. So they have been fighting to get back this land, to have this land back. And this is one of the process that the situations that I have been worked with. We are expropriating now the parcels of land to give the title deed to this community back, which was a very contentious process. But it's just to have an idea of what kind of situation they face when it comes to land tenure rights. So, talking about the insurgents of these groups, we can say that after the abolition of slavery, these communities, they exist. But to the wider Brazilian society and to the legal system, they were invisible. For centuries, we haven't heard anything about these groups. But these groups regained public attention in 1988 in Brazil during the discussion surrounding and writing of the new constitution, which was more democratic and inclusive following the past 2 decades of military rule. This year was also the anniversary of the abolition of slavery, so the Brazilian Black movement and many grassroots organizations promoted events, debates, and celebration around the situation of people of African descent in Brazil. Yes, so the Black movement was responsible for bringing the knowledge of the existence of remaining Quilombo communities into the public arena. They advocated for the existence of communities whose history was related to the slavery period and whose ancestors have been slaving in the past. And they managed to include provision in the new constitution, texts recognizing the right to culture, this is the first one, the right to culture, and to have their unique culture protected, as well as the right to collective ownership of land, of their traditional land that they have occupied in the past. So this article not only made the state and the society aware that this community remained in the countryside, but also was the first meaningful effort in the country's history to provide land right to descendants of former slaves. And here I just copy and paste the article in our constitution, which is something like final ownership shall be recognized for the remaining members of the Quilombo communities who are occupying their lands, and the state shall grant them the respective title deeds. And an interesting fact about this constitutional article that might interest the political science, and I'm a political science, so is that at the moment of the ratification of the constitution, neither the legislator nor the Black movement activists knew much about these communities. So they only knew a few communities at that time. And I will explain this to you. Beside that, very few academic studies of these communities exist in 1988. So the representatives who advocate for these articles announced in the press that the new law could benefit over 50 African descendant groups with land. This is this part, the left part of this slide. And 10 years later, there was a total of more 3,000 communities self-identified as Afro-Brazilian Quilombos. At the time of the passage of the new constitution, our congressperson meant to create a policy to protect cultural diversity and legacy of Africans in Brazil, to protect what they consider to be residues of the Quilombo or of the African culture in Brazil. They didn't mean to enable a policy to tackle land tenure inequalities, and they certainly didn't mean to change the structure of land tenure in favor of these groups. So the communities were viewed more as sites of history and memory than as living component of contemporary Brazilian history. That's why I made this, I built this slide to say that in 1988, our legislator considered these communities as archaic, as something residual in our society. So they meant to create a cultural policy. They didn't mean to create a land policy. But, however, this provision in the Constitution turned out to be an important instrument of claimants for land rights for these communities. They began emerging from rural areas, forests, and even urban areas, demanding their land rights to be recognized. So I think you can see the difference. Huh? I think it's clear to say that they didn't mean to create a policy that could tackle land inequalities in Brazil. They meant to create a policy only to protect something that they considered to be a residue of African in Brazil. And that's why I say that people shape policy. More and more, the communities became conscious that they should get organized, they should get together and take advantage of this article in the Constitution. So they have organized themselves and founded a national movement, which is the National Coordination of Quilombo Communities in Brazil. So just to come back, when we see policy as institutions in the sense that the political science Paul Pearson says then, that not only policy will shape and constrain people and behavior, but people can shape policy. We can see that this group has taken advantage of this article and they really start claiming for land and not only for protection of their culture. So that's what I was trying to say here. And just to move forward, talking about a little bit about the land titling process, trying to look at the strong points. So I would like to share with you how we do what we do to accomplish this mission and also point out some positive results and what we consider to be strong points of this policy. So Since 2003, INCRA, the agency that I work for, is in charge of running this program to grant title deeds to these communities. And according to the decree 4887, which was issued in 2003. So this decree encompasses some provisions that really represents progress toward the protection of the Afro-Brazilian as an ethnic group and their traditional land. And the first one is that the decree has a legal foundation in the International Convention 169 of the ILO, International Labor Organization. This convention states that the right of self-identification to tribal groups. So Brazil recognizes the right to self-identification as Afro-Brazilian community as the criterion of identity, to qualify to all the state-led programs tailored to these groups, including the land titling process. So rather than define these groups as in a role of characteristics that we expect them to have, we rely on self-consciousness, and this is a criterion underlined in a number of human rights documents internationally. Another strong point of the current procedure to grant land title deed is that the decree allows the state to grant not only the land currently occupied by these communities, but also the land their ancestors had occupied in the past. So we come back to the past. The definition of what land and how much land should we return to these families has been a very contentious issue since the 90s. And unlike the former decree from former governments, the current one does not only recognize the land they live, but also the areas from which they had been evicted in the past. So we have been working based on an expansive interpretation of the constitutional provision, which aims to expand the land available to these groups and return their ancestral territories. What else? Yes. So to delimitate the ancestral territory, we produce a study of the community and the land, which results in a technical report. This study uses anthropological and historical data to identify and delimitate the territory of the community. And to accomplish that, we use official record, but especially oral history. Why? Because oral history is a field of study and a method of gathering, preserving, and interpreting the voice of and memories of people about facts in the past. We rely on this method because the history and memories of most part of these groups haven't been told by the official history. These groups and their history of resistance and resilience mostly have been invisible in our history. And I would say that the main goal of these studies that we have been doing is understand the relationship between the community and the land they claim, because we are going to expropriate the landowner. So we need to understand the historical process behind the occupation of the land. And we need to unveil the bond that ties the group to a particular land. This is an essential criterion to move forward toward the title deed. For that, we work mostly with the concept of territory and territoriality. That's quite important. So the fact that for the first time we have been a national effort to tell and share history that were, I would say, in the shadow is considered a strong point in this policy. It results that we have today much more historical information about these groups, and a collection of narrative that represent the voice of these groups in the post-slavery area. And this represents part of the country's patrimony. This is the first pillar of the titling process, to acknowledge these groups as part of the Brazilian history and to highlight their past, but not only, but their present situation and condition. So this is Aldemir, the president of the Tenure community, and he's showing what we call the technical study very proud to see their community depicted in a book, for example, in a study. And the next most important step within the titling process is the agrarian reform. At this time in the process, the state expropriates all the land owners and landholders and compensate them by paying for the land and other assets. Afterwards, we are finally able to demarcate the territory and grant the title deed in the community in the name of what we call they have to form an association to receive the title deed. So the title deed, the property title is granted in a collective and indivisible, in according to the law. The communities cannot sell it, so they cannot do transactions with the land. So the second pillar would be to promote land distribution and to secure land tenure right by restoring the territory occupied by these communities. And then it's interesting to give you an example, and this is the one I like the most because I have been involved in this case. This is the case of Engenho Bonfim, Quilombo community. They are 39 families, and prior to the legalization of their territory, they occupied roughly 74 acres. For many years, they have received staple food, as part of the government initiative to alleviate poverty in the region. Most part of the men in the community worked in larger families around, and they also qualified for the cash transfer initiative we call Bolsa Familia. And I could watch what was a really major transformation in their livelihood in the recent 8 years, I would say. So the legalization of their ancestral territory allowed the community to expand their farmland to almost 300 acres. And along with the title granting, the families received credit from the program of strengthening of family farming. And once they have increased their vegetable production, they started selling the production to the government through the food acquisition program. And now they also supply vegetable in the urban area of the town. And recently, the good news is that they started an organic production, and this year, before I came here, they were certificated as organic farmers, and so we were really happy about that. These programs, just to mention, are two major programs in Brazil to foster family agriculture and to ensure food security. And this strategy are being praised for their contribution to fight against hunger. So the combination of former property rights and programs to enhance their capacity to farm was a turning point for these groups. And also looking at the historical and symbolical point of view today, and they occupied what in the past was the slave owner's residence. So it's a kind of a symbolic turning point for them. They are really proud to live in the house that the former slave owner used to live. And then the difficult part of it, so the challenge. So in my opinion, Brazil do have an ambition policy to acknowledge the Afro-Brazilian territories and securing the land tenure rights to these communities. However, there have been many challenges to effectively implementing the law, and I will point out some of them. And the first one would be the number of steps in the procedure. And you're not supposed to read that, but it's only to tell you that the process itself, it's a very long process, and it consists in more than 15 steps. I would say 15 steps. And both the technical studies required to identify the ancestral land and the history of each group, as well as the procedures to achieve the expropriation of each landowner, it requires a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of steps. And more than that, in this process, many actors are involved in. So Inca, the communities, the current landowners, because they can present objections to the process. The local government, if the community is living in a land which is state-owned, locally owned, they must be part of the process. We depend on the presidents of our country because ultimately he gives us the authorization to expropriate all the parcels, and we also depend on the judiciary. So we depend in a wide range of actors to accomplish our goal, which is the title deed in the end. So, and just to mention, the whole process can take 5 years, which is in the case where the area is a small parcel of land. In the case that we only need to expropriate one plot of land, but it can take more than a decade to achieve the title deed. So just for you to have an idea. And I think this map shows a lot. This map reflects the titling outcome since 1988, what was achieved by the federal government, but as well as as the state government, because they also can issue title deeds. So we have roughly 16,000 claims for the land, and less than 170 have come to the end, as you can see. And you also can see that most part of the claims are more concentrated in the northeast region in Brazil, which was the first region that has been colonized. So it has historical regions, and the burden of the long legal procedures plays an important role on these results, on these achievements. And however, it's not the only reason, I would say. Also, insufficient human resources and budget are also a constraint to implement this policy in a reasonable time. And no budget now. Surprise for the conclusion. And this is, I would call it a second challenge, which is we face a lot of competing claim and conflicts for the same area. This is a case that is far from being solved. This is a community also in the state of Paraná, Adelaide Maria. I don't know if you can see, but so this is the area that we had identified in our study as a quilombo. So this is the ancestral land. This is a park owned by the state. This is an area occupied by indigenous group. This is an airport. This is an area, a plot of land owned by the church. This is a urban settlement. This is also a urban settlement. And this is the place where the Quilombo community lives. In this area, we don't know much about the ownership. So in this case, we need to deal with these overlapping claims. Since there is a state-led, state-owned park, we need to talk to the local government to see if we have any chance to try to achieve agreements to make the community live in this place, and also to manage the forest. And so when the ownership is not clear, we don't know who is claiming for the land. We can have overlapping claimings, different alleged landowners claiming for the same parcel of land. And in this case, what we do is we work a lot on conflict mediation, and this is a kind of conflict that we are facing now. And we need to talk to the agency which is in charge of granting title deed to the indigenous community to legalize their land. We need to talk to the local government. We need to talk to the municipality in the town because there is a settlement there. So it's not something that we can expect to have output very quickly. We need to understand the flow of the conflict and to be able to work with different actors. And we in this case, we try to find out a solution to secure land rights. So maybe we are not going to return the whole territory, the whole ancestral territory. So we are going to negotiate and try to respect also the claim of the community, also based always with based on the also always based having in mind that we should respect the ILO Convention on Prior, Informed, and Free Consent. So this is a north for us. And the third challenge, and this is a more political challenge, is the concept of occupied land. So there has been many debates. Many debate remains over the definition of the term "who are occupying their lands," and I stress this. As I told you previously, the decree 4887 brings an expensive definition of occupied land that accommodates not only the land they currently live, but also the demarcation of the land their ancestors had occupied in the past. However, still today, the debate of definition remains, since the congresspersons that represent the agribusiness sector have sought to restrict their understanding of what constitutes occupied land. So there has been some attempts to evoke the decree 4887, and to introduce a different interpretation with cutoff dates for land claimings. There is a bill in the Congress and a legal action to be judged by the Supreme Court in Brazil that aims to change the rules. According to this action, it requires the community to prove that they physically occupied the land they are claiming in 1988, which is the year of the new constitution. So if they manage to pass a time limit, a numerous quilombos will be excluded, because in many cases the remaining communities had been evicted before 1988. And it's important to say that today powerful landowners yield considerable political influence in Brazil, and they resist any redistribution of land. Of course, there is a reaction about it. So this is a demonstration held by both indigenous communities and Afro-Brazilian communities to say that our history has not begun in 1988. They are trying to speak out that they existed before that, and the state should not set a cutoff limit to their lands. And to conclude, I would say that Brazil has a very ambitious and strongly worded law and policy, but there are many technical and political constraints limiting the effective implementation of the policy. And you can see when you saw the results of the policy. And unfortunately, there is a lot of evidence that the federal government is decreasing in efforts to guarantee the protection of collective property rights, both to indigenous groups and to Afro-Brazilian groups. And the political rhetoric behind says that Afro-Brazilian and indigenous communities are a barrier to development, all couched in the rhetoric that we need to make Brazil grow again. So it's a neutral sounding and non-racial excuse to remove and to limit protection of these groups, their culture, and especially their tenure rights. So I try to put some of the challenges and some of the trends here. And for example, we have been facing budget cuts, and we had a reduction of 60% from 2015 to 2017. We only work with 40% of what our budget was in 2015. There is a bill aiming to change the land titling proceeds with these cut dates for land claimings. And there is a rise in the number of homicides involving Afro-Brazilian communities. There was 8 in 2016, and this year until now, 14 Afro-Brazilian community members were murdered related to land conflicts. And in the other side, we have the increasing influence of the congressperson linked to the agribusiness sector over the executive branch in Brazil. And there is a bill to ease limits on foreigner purchase. They want to make it more flexible to foreigner companies to acquire land in Brazil. And normally these companies, they are able to acquire large parcels of land. And there's some shifts in the policy to grant title deeds in Amazon. Prior to this year, they were focusing more on the small landowners. And then after this recent change, the government is focusing more on medium landowners rather than small farmers. So it was just to give you an idea of the trends. They are not very optimist, I would say, but I needed to show you. So I think that's it.
Go ahead.
The questions.
Questions?
If you have questions, be happy to answer. Humphrey Fellows are not allowed to ask questions. Luis.
I have a lot of questions, but I'll try and keep it short. Does the government, either INCRA or related agency or any other government agency, once the land title is granted to the communities, have any management structures or rules for the communities other than the indivisibility of the title?
The short answer would be no, because they are considered as private titles. So it's a collective ownership, but it's a private one. So once the government title the group, grant the title deeds, they are considered as private. They cannot sell it, they cannot transact, they cannot divide it, but the government is not really giving any kind of support to this. So we know that in some regions, especially in these new agricultural frontiers in Brazil, some people are being co-opted to lease or to work on this land. So there are some agency who works more on the environmental side, that they are promoting trainings to them to manage the forest, but not INCRA. We say that, okay, you can do now in your own, which is different from the indigenous situation, because the indigenous land in Brazil are public land, so the state has to deal with it. They have to help the indigenous communities to manage, because it's under the government's responsibility. It's not the case for the Afro-Brazilian territory once titled. Yes. So.
Other questions? David?
Hi. So I actually have two questions if I can. So the first is, you spoke a little bit about how the INCA, the agency, depends on other sort of governments and structures to implement these things. But I'm wondering to what extent, you didn't mention the federal governments, the government in power. So I'm wondering to what extent sort of the increase in titling and the growth of these programs is dependent on which government is in power. And if you can say something about how maybe the PT being in power for this time really helped, and sort of, I think it's not surprising to people who pay attention to Brazilian politics that these cuts came under Tenure, things like this. But if you could say something about that. And then also I'm wondering a little bit about, so sort of any sort of policy in Brazil that's sort of race targeted is always controversial, and there's sort of this policy has sort of gotten some pushback in the media, at least some accusations about communities lying about being sort of Afro-descendants or sort of being these global communities. And so if you can say something about how maybe that resistance in the media or broader in public opinion affects the kind of work that you do, and maybe if you do anything to sort of counter those critiques in the title.
Yeah, I would say that we can see a clear shift now from the previous government, and I have worked as a coordinator for the previous government. So I would say that there is a change in the narrative. I know that also the former government has also implemented some budget cuttings, because I don't know if you know about the situation in Brazil, but it's for the president, it's very difficult to pass any bill without the majority in the Congress. And there has been some 10 years that this agribusiness sector has a lot of power, has an increasing power in Brazil. So the president has to do some coalitions to pass any bill in the Congress, especially now. But I can see a change in the narrative when it comes to these Temer governments now. And it's more clear now that these groups are considered as a barrier to development, that we need to speed up everything, we need to attract foreign investments, and we don't have time to deal with these questions. They try to put these groups, and when I say these groups, I mean the Afro-Brazilian communities and the indigenous communities, as part of a ideological project from the foreigner government. So this was an ideological project to give the country to these groups that they don't work, they don't need so much land, and this is the problem when we are talking about territories. There is a rising understanding that this is too much land for these people. We need land to make our country grow again. So it's very clear that they are trying to put this group back in this position as being only a cultural group, remaining residues from the past, not people who are claiming for land distribution. So I don't know if I make myself clear, but there is a clear shift in the narrative. And we have been dealing with this kinds of news that you have mentioned, that communities lying. But the thing is, the process to get to have the title deeds in this policy is so long that there's no incentive to these groups to lie. They have another kinds of policy that they can apply for. The agrarian reform, there are many policies to have credit to buy land. So there's no much incentive to these groups to lie. But we have had 2 cases that when we have started the study, the technical studies, the historical study, we have realized that they were not. They didn't have roots in slavery past, I would say. They were claiming for land, and they were so desperate because they failed to get land through the process of the agrarian reform, the traditional. They were not settled by the INCRA, the agency that I work for, that they were claiming for land in any interest that they could find. But it's not very common, I would say, because it's a risky for these groups to apply for land in Brazil. Because once they go to INCRA and they apply, and we go to the field and we start doing all the studies, locally, most part of the landowners will be against them. So there are many cases of people who lost their jobs in the farmers because they were claiming the land. So you are going to expropriate me, so you're not working here anymore, and they got fired. So it's risky. The process is long. There's not much incentive to people to lie like this. So it's not very common. But of course, these 2 cases, they had much attention from the media, saying that why they are claiming so much land. They are not even they don't have an African past. So I don't know if I answered you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that talk. That was really excellent, super clear, and a lot of information on something that's very complicated. So you presented it really well.
Thank you.
I have a question about INCRA as a particular kind of government agency that has its own problems and has also managed to fulfill this new role of both doing an expanded agrarian reform under Cardozo and then under Lula, but the quilombos and the issue of the slave communities got shoved into INCRA. And my experience was that many people in INCRA didn't know what to think about race. And I remember one example of an elderly couple coming to the door of INCRA and asking for cesta básica and the food baskets. And they were sent to the Quilombo office, not because the Quilombo office dealt with cesta básica, but because they looked dark-skinned. And so the front person in INCRA said, you must want the woman who deals with the black issues, go and talk to her. And it was a very uncomfortable relationship between land and between this more race-based sort of historical. You wouldn't think so. You would think they would. So I'm just wondering, in your experience, if you saw that tension within INCRA, or how it is that your group works with the other pieces of the agency.
Yes, we felt that tension, and I think this tension is still today there, Wendy. There are still some civil servants that cannot understand how race cross-cuts the issue of land in Brazil. There are some people who believe that we shouldn't work in this framework of territory, that it's too much land for people, that they don't understand the cultural side of it. And for them, for some of these people who work at INCRA, they would say, if you settle these families in a settlement, they will be happy. So why don't you do that? So it will be easier. And I think it will be easier, but in 2000, or I think more in 2003, the state decided that he would give the territories back. And I think it would be a very interesting study, by the way, a very interesting research on that, how INCRA is somehow had to swallow it. Not everybody accepts the idea to have a different framework, a different approach to land. And we have a separate group. So, and what is funny is that all the minorities come to us. If there is an indigenous coming to INCRA to ask about, I don't know, people will send to me to say, oh, this is indigenous. No, but here we only work with Afro-Brazilian communities, not indigenous communities. Oh, but this is a minority, right? You work with minorities. So all the minorities, they come to our office to see. So there's a lot of misunderstanding yet, especially in the north region from Brazil. And it took some time for people to understand that we are not only talking about land, we are talking about territory. Territory is the land that has a meaning, that is meaningful for a group. And I remember civil servants literally arguing with members of Quilombo community because they couldn't understand that, hey, the landowner gave me a testament. It was inherited. I have right to that. I should have this land, but I couldn't afford to pay for it. So it was a very interesting process, and I'm sure that, yes, you're right. It was difficult to put it within the INCRA structure right there.
Just a quick question, which is there any phenomenon of urban Quilombos? I mean, you showed the image with the airport in a small urban center, but I mean, city. Are there efforts to because there's a large urban slave population, and I don't know if there are any kinds of traditions of territoriality in larger urban spaces?
Yes, right. Yes, and these are the most challenging situation for us because we are an agency which works on rural land, so it's very challenging. So in Rio, for example, we have two, and what is very interesting is that they, even with the increasing urbanization, they could keep their land only for the group. And I don't know, you must know, you may know the favelas in Rio and how people just came and built their house. And these two groups, they managed to lock their lands, and only the group, the community is inside, which is quite rare because the spaces in Rio, they are being taken, squatted. So we do have, and we have a grant title. We grant the title deed for one community, and we had to expropriate one only one parcel of urban land, and the challenge was that it was expensive for the state to buy urban land because the prices are higher. So I think the most famous community now in Brazil is in Rio de Janeiro. It's a urban community. I think it represents only 5% of the Afro-Brazilian communities, those who lives in urban area. But in this case, it was so clear, it was so easy to understand their past, because we could see that they were somehow in the middle of the city, but they were isolated in the sense that they kept their territory only for the relatives of one former slave. So it was easy to see, but it's difficult to implement. Christian and Pedro.
Just a quick technical question, Isabella. So you were mentioning the change in narratives from the previous government to the current, but I was wondering how much autonomy does Inca have as an institution, or how much the government, the elected government, can intervene and change, the administration. So what's the impact of these changes of government within Inca? They can defund, but apart from that, how does it work?
Okay, so I think there has been some changes. Now Inca is under the presidents of the Republic. I don't know if you know this.
Sure,
yeah. We were related to the Ministry of Agrarian Development, and now they canceled it. They split, and there's no more a Ministry for Agriculture Development. There's only a secretary or something like that. So we are under the presidency of the Republic. So we have much more influence now. And the thing that is that our procedures are regulated by a decree, and the decree was issued by the president. So the president can change the decree whenever he wants to. So we feel that it can be changed, but I'm sure they are waiting for this action in the Supreme Court to decide. So they haven't decided yet. They had a session on last week. I was on the internet just watching the session. My roommate is my proof. But they haven't come to a decision yet. So, but the trend would be to put some cutoff dates. So if they cannot prove that they were in the land in 1988, we won't be able to legalize this territory. So nowadays, I would say we have increasing influence from the center of the executive, and they can just cancel this decree and write another one. Much power. See,
Isabella, you mentioned like all the studies that you have to do and how lengthy the process is, which made me think of what is the manpower that you need in order to just enter to one claim, to go from the claim to the deed? What kind of, like, how many manpower, how does that work? Do you have an idea of?
How many? Sorry.
Yeah, how many people? Yeah, people for how long?
Okay, to finish the process, you mean?
Mm-hmm. To go from claim to deed.
From claim to deed. So, yes, 15 steps. And the thing is, Inca is not doing this procedure alone. For example, to expropriate a parcel of land, you need to have an action in the court. So the judge will allow you to expropriate. Prior to that, the president of the Republic needs to authorize you to expropriate all the parcels. So the problem is, that's, I would say, a problem, but the thing is, there are so many actors involved that it's difficult for us to have annual goals. It's difficult to us to say, we can do this in 4 years, 5 years. Many conflicts arise. It's difficult to plan. And that's that's why it's so. It seems that everything is out of control. We cannot do our plans as if you were working in a policy that you just, or you give money, or you give food stamps, or you give only one parcel of land. So it's very difficult to predict. But there are some organizations that they have done some calculation, and they are saying to the media that we would take 900 years to finish all this process if we continue in this movement, in this basis. So I think, yeah, just to give you an idea. And,
I'm wondering, so it seems like the issue of land reform is seen more as assistencialista strategy rather than constitution, especially in the cases of like indigenous and Afro-Brazilian communities, which are not necessarily related to other social movements. But I'm wondering, what do you think would be the potential? I guess maybe I missed in the presentation the conversation between the cultural policy and the right to cultural heritage and the idea of, or the concept or practicality of territoriality or territory in reconstituting these land, or like proving that they were theirs. And the second part of the question, I guess, drawing from urban parallel to a question I probably don't understand is, doesn't uso capião, I don't know how to say in English, but like the fact that they've been there for a number of years would prove that they, you know, they've been cultivating the land and like fulfilling the social purpose as opposed to like just a title that, you know. Does that make sense? My question just.
yeah, I don't know how to say uso capião, but
Yeah. So like.
Prescription.
The what?
Campesino.
So it's just.
It's like occupation.
huh?
What do you mean when you-
specific, it has a specific indigenous derivative. I mean, it basically means where the camp was set up.
Usucapião is used for everything.
Yeah.
Like in urban settings at least. But I'm just wondering because there is isn't in the land like statute that if you prove to be producing in that land for a number of years, you would have.
But the thing is, and our main the one of the main goals of these policies is to return their territories back. So they have lost it for different reasons.
Okay.
They haven't been able to purchase the land. They were evicted. They were displaced. So
you only intervene once.
yes, Onzo Capião is for the land that the parcel of land that you are using, right? For the other ones that you are not using now, it doesn't work. So the idea is to expand their land, because most part of them, especially in the northeast of Brazil, they have only small plots of land. So normally they only grow food to their own consumption, and they work in different farmers as diária, meio. And in northeast, it's very common that the men go to São Paulo to work in the sugarcane plantation, and then they come back with some money, but they are not able to produce food to be part of economic change. And most part of them really live in subsistence ways of life. If they don't have the land, and if they don't have secure land rights, they are prone to be evicted. There will be more chances for him to be displaced